Okay, let's get going. Only 1 minute late. Supposed to be 107 of you, which is good because that doesn't fit in the room, right? There's about 30 people watching online, and the rest will have to do with a recording. This is environmental economics. If you're wrong, then this is the time to leave. Nobody feels inclined. I've never been in this lecture theater, so I'm guessing which lighting is best. It doesn't seem to make any difference. My name is Richard Toll. I'm gonna be here. This is what I used to look like. This is better, right? Lightning wise. I'm a professor of economics in the economics department. If you want to talk to me, email is best. I respond to Skype as well. I'm gonna try and spend as much time at home as feasible because we're still in a pandemic, right? I'm gonna teach you about environmental economics, which is actually very close to my research area. I mostly work in climate and energy, but also do bits of environment proper. So that's what I'm going to do. You may have noticed that next term I'm going to talk about climate in more detail. So what is going to happen in these 10 weeks is that I'm going to give you a comprehensive introduction to the economic theory of environmental pollution and environmental policy. And as I said, climate change will wait to next term. I'm going to assume that you've done your micro and your macro courses, as well as your calculus. It won't be very heavy on the calculus. The exams and everything are designed so that you can pass without calculus. But you won't score a first without calculus. The book we're gonna read from is Charlie Kolstad's ones, which is, I think, the best book at this level. It's also one of the cheapest. One of you protested that they had to buy the book. The library is the library, right? They don't have enough copies. It's a somewhat older book. There's no electronic copy as far as I know. The book is somewhat older and I think somewhat incomplete. So I started writing my own lecture notes initially as a complement to the book. But those of you who have looked at the latest version that I put up yesterday would know that also I'm gradually replacing parts of the book. But if you look at my lecture notes, you see that they are very incomplete. I will post updates as we go along through the semester, but it won't be finished before Christmas. I can assure you of that. The lectures are on Tuesdays, starting at 9:15 and then running for 1.5 hours till 10:45, and then there's 3 seminars, Thursday at 1 and 2 and Friday at noon. The topics we're going to cover are these. I'm going to start today with social choice. Then next week it's externalities and public goods. I'm going to talk about policy instruments. Then we're going to have a reading week, which means that the discussion of policy instruments is cut short. It was not my idea that you need a break in the middle. Then we're going to talk about monetary valuation, and then finally about 2 special topics, growth and green accounting. And all of this is subject to industrial action. There are 3 disputes going on. At the national level, the universities have a conflict with the pension provider. The universities have their own pension fund. The problem with the pension fund is that it's run by a bunch of clowns who do not even manage to track the market. So they lost a lot of our money. And they've set it up as essentially a Ponzi scheme. Our pensions are sufficient provided that the university sector keeps growing, that there's more and more young lecturers paying in to pay for the pensions of the retired professors. And the regulator rightly said you should not run your pension fund as a Ponzi scheme, right? That is not a smart strategy. And as a result of these two things, they're really going to screw us over our pensions, right? 30% cut in how much we'll get once we retire. And you can expect industrial action nationwide over this. There's also a university conflict over, the university is actually in good financial shape, but the Vice Chancellor and the Council have nonetheless decided that colleagues will need to be fired, and you can expect a lot of unrest around that as well. And then there's a third conflict, and that is in the school, and that is because the dean has decided to dig over our doctoral tutors. Now that does not affect you, because in third year the seminars will be done by faculty, not by doctoral tutors, but you do recall these people from year 1 and year 2. Those are the people that ran your seminars, the typically PhD candidates. And they cut their pay, they announced to cut their pay by 28% 1 week before term started. So they are also a little bit cross, and you can also expect unrest over this. So this is the plan at the moment, and it's subject to disruption. There's other disruptions that may be going. Last year we had to switch at the last minute. Actually, I got a 40-minute notice last year to switch to online lectures. All that material is preserved. So those of you who like that style of teaching, that is pre-recorded lectures, everything is still there. I won't deviate much from what I taught last year. So all those pre-recorded videos are still there. I will make use of some of these things. You may notice that I'm a white, middle-aged man, able-bodied. I'm as straight as they come. And I can't help that, right? The good thing about pre-recorded lectures is that you can actually diversify the lecturers. So at 2 points, when talking about environmental justice, I'm going to give the floor to people who do not look like me, which I think is good. And also in the very final week, I'm going to give the floor to people I strongly disagree with, right? And I think they should speak about what they think rather than me talking about what I think they think wrong. So all that stuff is there, still there. I'm going to make use of it when necessary. But also we have another possible disruption, and that is, well, I'm going too fast. We have a pandemic. We're now in the 6th wave, right? So they may close the university again. And of course, we're in the middle of a fuel crisis. And I live further from campus. So I drive here, and I think I can make it until Tuesday next week, but I won't be able to make it beyond that. And of course, as you may have noticed, the cycling infrastructure in Sussex is woeful. We will be returning to the causes of why cycling provision is so bad in England in week 10. So much for an introduction. The seminars are actually going to start this week. We're going to do problem sets and discussions. Next week we're going to play a game that's going to be an online game. So next Thursday, next Friday, you don't need to come to campus for this, but you do need to be online. There is background reading. that may be discussed in the seminars if we have time. And towards the very end, the last 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to use the seminars for exam preparation. Right? The exams of last year and the year before are, yes, last year and the year before are on Canvas for you to look at. This is the type of questions, the style of questions that I may expect. The take-home exam, it will be a take-home exam. I don't fully understand why, but you are allowed to attend this face-to-face, but you're not allowed to sit in an exam hall this term. So it will be a take-home exam. And then the take-home exam will be technical. There will be sums to solve. You have 24 hours, and it will be sort of like a number of short questions with an answer that is true or not true, right? Simple as that. You just do some calculations. Mostly, there's some reflection, but it's mostly solving problems. The other part of the grade, which I here reduced to 2,000 words, is an essay, and that is very much reflexive, qualitative. I'll ask you to give your opinion about something. We did the same last year. The question this year, or the essay, will be similar in structure. So I'll also post the best and the worst essays of last year, right? Or rather, what I thought the best and the worst, right? Which is, of course, the information that you need. Every week there is a quiz on Canvas. They are graded, but they do not count towards your final mark. This is for you to revise, for you to keep track. Do I actually know my stuff? The problem sets that we're going to do in the seminars are not graded either. Are not graded at all. There is one word there. But the material there may be examined, right? So they are a core part of the material. So much for my introduction. Any questions? Anything unclear? No? You guys are as shy in the classroom as on Zoom. It's good to see you guys, that you're actually three-dimensional and stuff. Sick to the back teeth of looking at Zoom and looking at things that pretend to be people but may as well just be a figment of my computer's imagination. So I'm going to start with the first lecture, 3/4 of an hour. If you've looked at the program, you notice that last year I actually started with a bit of the history of the discipline of environmental economics. I'm going to skip that for sake of time. It won't be examined, but if you're interested, all the material is there. Instead, I'm going to talk about the issue of social choice. And you've seen bits of it, but you've not seen quite nearly enough. And I'm going to split this into 2 parts. I'm going to talk about the ethical foundations of social choice. And towards the end, I'm going to talk about sustainability, a core concept in environmental policy. Now, this is an economics class. Why will I spend the next hour talking about ethics? Economics is about the allocation and distribution and use of resources, and environmental economics is about the allocation, distribution, and use of environmental resources. Environmental economics is to a large extent part of public economics. That is, it is about advising the government what to do and how to do it. And part of these questions are positive questions. If I raise the price of energy because I don't like the externalities, the environmental pollution that comes out of that energy use, if I raise the price of energy, how much will environmental pollution fall? That is a positive question. It is a standard what if type of question, and it's a matter of measurement and so on and so forth, and that is largely objective, right? But other questions in public economics and environmental economics are normative questions. How high should I raise the price of energy, or how low should I push pollution? How much emissions should I avoid? That is a normative question, and they are always value laden. You can't escape an assessment of what is good and what is better or what is worse. Now, basically all of the economics you have seen so far is utilitarian, and most of it is actually narrow utilitarian. The problem with utilitarianism is that it's a minority position. If you go to a conference of moral philosophers, people who study ethics, and you announce that you're a utilitarian, they probably look at you very, very strangely, because it is really a tiny minority of moral philosophers, of ethicists, think that utilitarianism is any acceptable way of looking at problems of public policy. And as soon as you start doing work outside of economics, as soon as you're confronted with people who are not trained economists, as soon as you go out in the real world, you leave the confines of the economics department, you will be confronted with this fact that the ethical system on which you make your policy recommendations will be challenged, right? So you need to know at least where it's coming from and what are its limitations and what are the alternatives. And this is not typically taught in year 1 and year 2 anywhere in the world, actually, not in year 1 and 2 if you study economics, right? So I am going to catch you up on this. And I'm going to talk about 3 schools of thought on the ethics of public policy. Naturalist moral philosophy and humanist moral philosophy, and then humanists will be split into 2. There's many, many more schools of ethics, but I won't touch on them. These are the 3 that are most important. You can't talk about ethics without talking about Immanuel Kant. Kant is the preeminent philosopher, ethicist. He's comparable to Adam Smith, but whereas most economists see Adam Smith sort of as a forefather who we sort of like don't take very seriously anymore, right? He's a nice historical reference. Philosophers actually still study Kant and have intense discussions about what he said and did not say. I think the right conclusion there is that he was a horrible writer. That 200 years, 300 years later, we still haven't figured out what he actually meant to say. But philosophers take this man's writing very, very seriously. I'm not going to go into everything that he said, that's quite impossible, but he did introduce 2 innovations into moral philosophy. The first is the introduction of a moral agent. That is essentially the unit of analysis compared to an economic agent, right? This is our smallest unit that we consider. And he introduced the rule of, my coffee is falling apart, the universal rule, which essentially says that if a moral right or duty applies to one agent, it applies to all agents. So if you are a moral agent and I am a moral agent, and I think that you cannot steal my coffee, that is a rule that I would like to impose on you, then by implication, because you are a moral agent too, I cannot take your coffee. Right? That is essentially what Kant said about this. And it's an appealing thing to do, right? It's not quite the same as the Christian do not unto others, right? It's different, but it's similar. The question is, of course, who is a moral agent? And I'm going to start this with, inappropriately, with the father of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, who you see here. And Bentham, as you know, argued that the government should strive for the greatest good for the greatest number, which in Bentham's time was a radical proposition. This was 18th century England, where the government was run for the benefit of rich, white Protestant men. Right? That is what the government was about. And Bentham said, no, 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 this is wrong. You also have to care about poor people. You need to care about non-white people. You need to care about women. And in a writing that was discovered long after his death, he actually never dared publish this. He also argued that we should care about homosexuals. So this was, in 18th century England, quite a radical position. The greatest good for the greatest number, not rich, white Protestant men. And this sort of set into motion a whole cascade of reasoning. Because the people who were doing the reasoning, the philosophers who made these arguments, like Bentham, were all rich white Protestant men. And they argued, well, perhaps we should not just care about people who are like us and who look like us, but we should care about others as well. And that set in a cascade of rights and duties and arguments that started, actually it took 100 years after Bentham's death, that the vote was extended to poor people. That poor white men in England were allowed to vote for the House of Commons. Right? So that was the first thing. So you can't make wealth an argument for inclusion. It's not just the case that rich men have rights, but the universal rule of Kant also applies to poor white men. Right? That was essentially how this was interpreted at the time. And it took 100 years after Bentham for this to be generally acknowledged in England. Although if you look at the current government, not quite sure that everybody got the message, right? Females came later, right? The vote for women came much later than the vote for poor men. Emily Pankhurst was one of them. Rights were extended to non-whites later, and this is Nelson Mandela, of course, you know the story. But now you have a problem as somebody who wants to be an objective ethicist, because you started off by saying, well, the traditional position was that a moral agent is somebody who, like me, is a middle-aged, rich, white man, right? And now these middle-aged, rich, white men were saying, well, perhaps, actually, if I say the first here were the poor, but the first were actually the Catholics, were allowed to have their say, and then the poor men were allowed to have their say, and then the women were allowed to have their say, and then the non-white people were allowed to have their say. At that point, you're sort of saying, well, where's the demarcation? The demarcation is no longer people like me. So you need to come up with a different demarcation. And that has to be objective. You can't say, well, the demarcation is that it's somewhat similar like me. So the first thing that people said there, well, we should really make a distinction between, if we're going to impose rights and duties, about people who are actually, or about beings that are actually able to exercise that judgment. And initially the reasoning was that we, humans, are aware of the difference between ourselves and our environment. And therefore, we can be held to account for things that we do to things elsewhere, right? We know the difference between ourselves and what is around us, and therefore we can be held to account for our actions. And that sort of seemed for a while a good way out, but then those pesky biologists started doing experiments with animals, and what they found is that if you put an elephant in front of a mirror, that elephant will recognize itself in the mirror. And if you study elephants, then you know that they actually are social animals, and they recognize other animals of their own species, and they recognize humans, they recognize all sorts of things, they have a memory, they seem to have a moral code, and so on and so forth. And if that is your criterion, that you can be held to account for your actions, then elephants and dolphins and gorillas and chimps and bonobos and everything do recognize this. And the argument there is that those moral rights and duties should be extended to these elements to a certain degree, right? In the reading material, there is a piece in a newspaper that I forgot. I think it's the New York Times, but I'm not 100% sure, about a ruling that was made in Argentina about a orangutan, and the judge reasoned that the zoo locked up this orangutan, but it hadn't stolen anything, it hadn't murdered anyone, so why was it locked up? Why was it imprisoned? This is not fair, and ordered the zoo to release the orangutan, right? Just as you cannot be locked up, imprisoned, when you didn't do anything wrong, why would you be allowed to lock up an animal that is just as intelligent as you are, right? In many ways. The orangutans are not able to speak because their throat is different, but don't doubt their intelligence, right? So that was the first step. But if you're a utilitarian and you think that what matters is pain and pleasure, you can put a parakeet in front of a mirror, and if you put a parakeet in front of a mirror, the parakeet will think there is another parakeet, let's sing a song together. And even if the parakeet in the mirror does not sing back, the parakeet will keep singing to the mirror, hoping that the parakeet in the mirror will respond, right? Parakeets are pretty damn stupid. But they do experience pain and pleasure. And if you think that that is what matters, that that is how we should do our calculus, that we should minimize pain and maximize pleasure, then you should extend those rights to sentient beings. The reason that parakeets are able to experience pain and pleasure, much like we do, is because they have a central nervous system. But if you can't argue that a moral agent is a moral agent because that moral agent, like me, is a rich white man, you also cannot argue that a moral agent is a moral agent because, like me, a moral agent has a central nervous system. So some philosophers say, well, this should go to all beings. If you chop a worm in two, if I chop you in two, I have two dead halves of you, right? If you chop a worm in two, you have two viable worms. And that is because they don't have a central nervous system. Another animal that doesn't have a central nervous system is the octopus that you see here. An octopus actually has 9 brains, one central one, and then 8 mini ones in each of the tentacles. And that means that they experience the world very, very different than we do. But octopuses are actually pretty intelligent as well. But they don't have a central nervous system, so that cannot be an argument either. So some people say we should extend rights to all living beings. By now, you are getting uncomfortable, right? In the English tradition, being kind to animals is something that is normal, right? Actually, England has the oldest laws against animal cruelty. But the notion that this should extend to all living beings, now you're getting into certain sects of Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism that, to English eyes, and looking around the room, not everybody here is ethnically English, is a bit extreme, right? But there are definitely people who argue this. The Jains being foremost among them. The problem with this argument is that if you look at it through a microscope, it's actually very difficult to tell the difference between something that is living and something that is not. And you may have picked up this sort of notion, the news that we found life on Mars, right? The problem there is that actually it's very difficult to say whether something is organic and living or organic and not living, right? That's actually very difficult to draw that distinction. And viruses is a good example. We're actually not quite sure whether viruses are alive or not. Definitely troublesome. But they're somewhere between a chemical compound and an organism. So some people have said, well, these duties should extend to all beings. And I'll get back to that at the end of this lecture. Just as you have the right to bodily integrity, I cannot chop off your arm. Probably agree. Some people say, well, oil reserves have also the right to bodily integrity, and you cannot just suck out part of them. And that is a position that is taken by deep ecologists. But also in some traditional cultures, there are holy rocks. And you see one of the holy rocks in Australia depicted here, and there's holy trees and so on and so forth, things that you cannot actually, I'm talking about all beings, and trees are alive, right? So there are such things as holy rocks in certain cultures. To our eyes, this may seem very extreme, but there are definitely people who argue this. So that is naturalism. Who counts and what counts, right? The other two schools of moral philosophy that I'm going to talk about are strictly humanist. What matters is what matters to humans. And elephants only matter to the extent that elephants matter to us, that we care about elephants. Which is not the same as how elephants care about elephants, right? That's a different story. and presumably they care more about themselves than we do about them. There's two main schools, opposite schools in humanism, moral philosophy. I'm going to start with libertarianism. Libertarianism is all about individual rights and duties. What matters is the process, not the outcome. The father of libertarianism is John Locke. That's the elderly gentleman you see at the top. Locke argued that if you go into the forest and you chop down the trees and you prepare the land for cultivation, then that land has become useful by your labor, by your actions, and therefore that land is yours. The only rightful property is the property that was acquired through your labor. And Locke wrote this as an argument against absolute monarchy, right? In his time, I believe, okay, I'm not going to venture who this was. It may have been the Tudors, argued that all of England and Scotland was theirs, right? Including land that was not cultivated. And Locke said, no. If you make this land useful, it is yours. And this is, of course, reflected in the Homestead Act in the US later, right? But this is a pretty useless way of thinking about this, right? Because we acquire most things not through our labor, but through exchange. Robert Nozick, who you see at the bottom here, argued that property is also just if it is acquired through free consent. If there's a voluntary exchange of rightfully acquired property, then that is fine too. And that is all there is to libertarianism. You start with rightfully acquired property, and then you freely exchange goods and services with mutual consent, and as long as that is going on, everything is fine. So there's absolutely no concept of consequential justice. The final outcome doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is how you got there. There is therefore no role for the government to redistribute income or resources. And most libertarians would argue against taxation. Because you did the labor, you earned the wage, that money is yours, and the government should keep its dirty hands off that money. Right? That is the position of a libertarian. And there's quite a few of these people in the US still. In the UK, they're much rarer. This is the right wing of the Tory party. That is not to say that the government does not have any role. The government should obviously guard against unjust holdings, theft, so a sort of a night watch state. The government obviously has a role to play in the provision of public goods and in the prevention of externalities, right? Or the internalization of externalities. But this is a pretty limited government. This is the government of Adam Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, right? The classical liberals in the English sense of the word. I should say British sense of the word, right? Because a good few of them were Scots. Utilitarianism is the exact opposite of libertarianism. Utilitarianism is all about pain and pleasure. It's about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And Bentham comes back and says that the government should strive for the greatest good, the greatest amount of pleasure, the greatest amount of happiness or utility, whatever you want to call it, for the greatest number. And utilitarianism stops there. There is no sense of process. The only thing that matters is the outcome. It doesn't matter how you got there. So a utilitarian is quite happy with the government of Singapore, right? Which is a fairly authoritarian regime, but people in Singapore are pretty rich, public services are pretty good, it's a very orderly, very safe society, and utilitarians say, yeah, we don't care about democratic rights, we only care about the outcome. People are wealthy and healthy. That's the only thing that matters. The people in Hong Kong will tell you, no, other things matter too, right? But a utilitarian would say, no, we don't care. There's narrow utilitarianism, and that is the utilitarianism that you would see mostly in economics, and that is that utility is individual. The only thing that matters is my pleasure. That's the only thing I care about. The only thing that matters are humans, and welfare, social welfare, is just the sum of individual utilities. That is narrow utilitarianism, but you can actually have a broad utilitarianism as well. Some people would say, then it's not utilitarianism anymore, but I think those people are mistaken. Where utility can be defined as, I do not only care about my own pleasure, but also about the pleasure of my children. You may extend this sort of reasoning to other non-humans, and instead of just using the sum of utilities, you can use some aggregate of utilities, right? Just a quick recap of welfare theory. A core concept in economics is Pareto superiority. Pareto is the guy at the top, and you would say that situation A is Pareto superior to a situation B if at least one person is better off in the new situation and nobody is worse off, right? That is Pareto superiority. And then we call a situation Pareto optimal or efficient if there are no Pareto improvements, right? And these are core concepts. This is completely impractical, right? That you would only do things that make nobody worse off, that never hurts anybody. It's great if you can do that, but typically you can't. Typically there's real trade-offs to be made. And therefore Kaldor and Higgs, who you see here, introduced the concept of potential Pareto improvements. That situation A is preferred to situation B if it's Pareto superior after transfers. That is, if the winners of the intervention can compensate the losers, right? That is potential Pareto superiority. Or if you listen to an economist who's steeped in the jargon, it satisfies the Kaldor-Higgs criterion. That is what those ugly words mean, right? We have, of course, our fundamental welfare theorems that a perfectly competitive market is in a Pareto optimum. That's the first welfare theorem. But it's important to note that when you talk about a Pareto optimum, it is not necessarily optimal, right? There are, in fact, many Pareto optima. And the second fundamental welfare theorem says that any Pareto optimum can be achieved as a perfectly competitive equilibrium if you reallocate resources. So if you shift the starting point And you would still find the Pareto optimum, but it may well be a different Pareto optimum. And this theory doesn't tell you anything about how to choose between Pareto optima. It just says they're all Pareto optimums, right? The work goes back to Adam Smith, of course. You know this in the incarnation that is derived by the guy at the right bottom, Harold Hotelling, and the other guys are somewhere in between. If we want to choose between Pareto optima, if we want to say, well, we should reallocate resources, and if we shift money, say, from me to you, it reaches a different Pareto optimum. Is that a good thing? Yes or no? You need a welfare function. And now we're back at utilitarianism. We need to somehow, I should have animated this better, we should somehow aggregate utilities to a welfare function. So if we denote utility by U and our bundle of consumption, which can include anything you care about, we denote that by X, and we say that your well-being depends on your consumption. And then social welfare, W, is some function of our individual utilities. And this is known as a Bergson-Samuelson, and those are the two gentlemen you see at the top, welfare function. Tony Atkinson, that's the guy with the white beard, made this more specific and essentially put down an CES aggregate or a generalized mean, if you want. Where essentially you say that social welfare is the sum of individual utility raised to the power 1 minus gamma, where gamma is your inequality aversion. And then you have to normalize it by 1 minus gamma, because we're always interested in taking first partial derivatives of things, and then things are much easier if you divide by 1 minus gamma. And also if gamma goes to 1, it actually behaves properly. And there's different versions of this. The standard version that you would see in most of economics is to set that inequality aversion equal to 0. And then we just add up utility of people, right? And that is what Bentham proposed. John Rawls, now we should care about what's happening to the poorest in society. And if you let your gamma go to infinity, you let it become very, very large, this Atkinson function essentially turns into the minimum. That the only thing you care about is the plight of the poorest in society. Nietzsche proposed the exact opposite and said we should only care about the richest in society, and then you let your gamma go to minus infinity. And then one of the Bernoullis, but I forget which one, and John Nash said we should set gamma to 0 and then what your gamma to 1, sorry, and then instead of taking the sum, you multiply utilities, and that put also additional weight on what is going on in the poorest in society, or rather with changes in the poorest in society. So all these options are there. Unfortunately, we cannot say which is the right option here. And that goes back to Ken Arrow's work. What you see here is an older Arrow. He did this when he was pretty young. And Arrow's impossibility theorem says that if you have an economy with 2 agents and 3 goods, or 3 agents and 2 goods, then you cannot construct a social welfare function that is consistent with your individual preferences. You cannot aggregate individual preferences to social preferences if the following conditions are met. 1, utility is not comparable. I cannot say whether you are happier than I am. I can say, if I know you, that you are happier today than yesterday, but I cannot, and I know whether I am happier today than yesterday, but I cannot compare our happiness in any meaningful way. So if you impose that conditions, and we don't know how happy other people are, right, at an absolute level, and if you assume non-dictatorship, that is, nobody in society is the boss, and you assume non-imposition, I cannot impose my preferences on you. I like peanut butter, but I cannot make you like peanut butter, right? Unrestricted domain, you can apply it to anything. Independence of irrelevant alternatives. If you introduce an inferior option that nobody would ever choose, then that should not affect your behavior. And monotonicity. That is, if you think something is good, then more of it is better, right? If you impose those conditions on your social welfare function, then even if you have two agents and three goods, or three agents and two goods, then you cannot aggregate individual preferences to social preferences. It is simply not possible, right? So these welfare functions that I suggest here cannot be empirical. We cannot go out and measure people's preferences and then aggregate them to a social preference function, a social welfare function, and say this is what the government should do. That is not possible, right? It just cannot be. So we're in a bind here, right? Which immediately implies that whatever welfare function you pick, it's not objective, right? It's a choice that you make. We talked a bit about utilitarianism and some of the limits of utilitarianism. There are also people who completely reject utilitarianism. And one of the main critiques, modern critiques of utilitarianism, comes from John Rawls. You see here one of the main philosophers of the 20th century. And Rawls argued that justice is what everyone would agree to. If all who do the agreeing are free to choose, are rational, actually know what they're doing, and they're impartial. And that impartiality comes about, that actually he introduced the veil of ignorance there. That is his main innovation in the method of ethical reasoning, the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance essentially works as follows. We are currently in this situation, right? You guys sit here, I stand there. Is that right? Is that proper? It's very hard to reason that. So in the veil of ignorance, essentially what you do is you take everybody out of the classroom, and then later on you're going to put them back in, but you do not know whether you will be sitting there or standing here. And then you make your decisions about how we distribute power in the classroom, right? More generally, Rawls said you can only be impartial when you judge a society if you don't know the skills you will have, if you don't know your position in the society you're designing, and you don't know your attitudes towards power and towards inequality. And only if you do not know these things, then you can say this society is just or unjust. Only if you do not know how you will fare and what your position will be in that society, only then can you be impartial, right? From these basic principles, Rawls argued for two things. One is maximum liberty. You should be allowed to do whatever you want, provided that you do not infringe on other people. It's a very libertarian position, right? You may be straight, right? And therefore have something against gay people. But if we put you behind the veil of ignorance and you don't know whether you're gay or straight, then of course you would argue, well, as long as it's mutual consent, you should have sex with adults. You should be allowed to have sex with whomever you want, right? Provided that that other person or persons consent, right? Maximum liberty. As long as you don't harm others, you should be allowed to do whatever. You should be allowed to paint your house pink if you want to, right? Which I think is an eyesore and it should be forbidden. But then again, my eyes don't really hurt when I look at a pink house. It's just that it's an affront to my sense of taste. But that's okay, right? Maximum liberty. Rawls also argued that in certain circumstances, there should be differences in income. Of course, if you put everybody behind the veil of ignorance, and if you come back from behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know how rich you would be, your argument would be, well, everybody should be equally rich, right? Because the one at the bottom of society may be me, right? But Rawls actually argues that you can allow for income differences under two conditions. One, if it makes everyone better off, that's Pareto superiority again. Or second, if it is attached to position. So a Rawlsian would argue that doctors should be allowed to earn more than other people because they need to be available 24/7 in case of emergency. And of course they need to spend 8 or 12 years training to become a doctor and should be rewarded for that. A notary, on the other hand, should not be allowed to earn more than other people because notaries open at 9 in the morning and close at 5 in the afternoon. And yeah, they spend a little bit longer training than other lawyers, but not a whole lot. So really, notaries should not be compensated to the obscene levels that they are, right? The reason that notaries are so very rich is because they hold a monopoly, not because what they do is that useful, right? Or that special. And Rawls would say that is not allowed, right? Similarly, a fire person should be available 24/7 in case of emergency, and therefore should be rewarded more than people who can just go to bed at night, being assured that nobody would call them in the middle of the night for their services, right? So that is Rawls. Pretty egalitarian society and a pretty free society. Some have interpreted it in a utilitarian way, and I just did, right? I said, well, this is a Rawlsian welfare function, where we just maximize the utility of the least well-off in society. Rawls would probably disagree. He never was quite explicit about this. There's other critiques of utilitarianism. I talked about naturalism, right? And I talked about libertarianism, and people who follow those schools of thought obviously disagree with utilitarians. But there's also critiques from within, and most of them are in some way or other associated with the guy you see here, Amartya Sen. And Sen argued that utility is too narrow. There's other things that matter as well. I compared Hong Kong and Singapore Freedom, maybe. Democracy, maybe good in and of itself. This is very difficult to put into a utility function, because what typically goes into a utility function is your income and your consumption. But democracy is not something that you have. It is something that your society has. It's a characteristic of your country. It's not a characteristic of you. So that makes it difficult. Altruism may matter, right? You may care about other people. You may just be happy because the people around us are happy. Responsibility is another motivation of how we act. And agency is another issue. These are mostly objections to utilitarianism as a description of human behavior. And agency is best understood with, and responsibility is best understood with an example. So we're allowed back in pubs again, right? So you may go to the pub on Thursday night or on Friday night, and you may observe a guy who looks just like me chatting up a girl who looks just like Kaya. And thoughts would go through your head, right? Probably think, sad loser, out of his league, right? Those are the sort of thoughts that may come to your mind if you observe this in a pub. If you observe this after class, a guy who looks just like me chatting up a girl who looks just like Kaya, other thoughts would come to your head beside out of his league and sad old man, right? Because now all of a sudden there is a power relationship, and you would more strongly condemn the behavior of the guy who just looks just like me, right? That is agency. You behave differently if you're with your parents than if you're with your peers, with other students, or with your colleagues at work, right? You are the same person, but you behave differently, depending on the role that you play, right? I behave differently towards my students than I behave towards other people, because you are, to a degree, in my care, right? And I behave differently towards my children than towards other children. The example I gave you is an example. I never do that sort of stuff, okay? But it brings home the message. And I picked on Kaya because he's the only one whose face and name I know, yeah? And then, of course, the final criticism of utilitarianism is that it can lead to repugnant conclusions. If you just take the sum of utilities, then you can take away all the money of the poor and give them to the rich, and it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. A utilitarian welfare function doesn't care about the income distribution. So, I think that is the end of my discussion on utilitarianism and ethics. I'm now going to change gear and talk about sustainability. And sustainability is a core concept in environmental policy. And it's an ethical concept, and that is why the two are together. The roots of sustainability go back to John Stuart Mill, the ugly guy at the bottom, who wrote in 1857, if the earth must lose that great portion of its pleasantness which it owes to things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would extirpate from it, for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger but not a happier or better population, I sincerely hope, for the sake of posterity, that they will be content to be stationary long before necessity compels them to it. And this is, I think, the first definition of sustainability. Now, this was Mill, who, like all other classical economists, believed that in the end, the economy will stop growing. Because we live on a finite planet, and therefore we cannot grow indefinitely, and at one point economic growth will stop, right? So that is where stationarity, the word stationary comes in, and necessity compels us to be stationary. So that is the first thing I want to say about this. But then Mill says, actually, I don't want to go there. I don't want to live in a society where we have maximized the number of people and maximized our consumption. I think we should stop growing before that point, because there's other things that matter. We should voluntarily restrain ourselves from economic growth because of other things. And that is true for population growth, and he explicitly talks about that. You will have meaningful relationships throughout your life. It may be 100 people, and you will meet 10,000 people or so. And assuming that you're picky about who you have a relationship with, if there's 100 million people on the planet, then you will have a fulfilling social life, right? You don't need those 8 billion that are there currently, because the vast majority of them will mean nothing to you. You will never meet them, and they will not bring sort of unique skills or unique insights or unique anything that 100 million people cannot provide as well, right? You don't need so many people. Similarly, and that's the other thing that Mill argued, you can grow richer and richer and richer and richer, but if that comes at the expense of environmental quality, then perhaps you shouldn't want that, right? Perhaps you should accept to be a little bit less rich in a nicer environment, right? That is essentially what Mill argued. We move forward. What is it? Okay. You wondered who is the woman who is there, right? That is Harriet Taylor Mills. Yes. Harriet Taylor was first a friend, platonic friend of Mill, and later his wife. And she actually co-wrote most of this. This was at the time that women were not supposed to do this, so all their joint publications were published under his name, but really it was joint work of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill. So that is why she is there. Okay, if we move forward 140 years in time, 130 years in time, to what is now generally accepted as the definition of sustainability. This is due to Gro-Harlem Brundtland and colleagues, and they define sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's very hard to disagree with this, right? We should live our lives in such a way that our children and grandchildren can also live their lives. That is essentially what this says. Leave the toilet as you would like to find it, right? That's sustainability. But it's a pretty vague definition, right? Future generations, is that all generations, if it goes wrong for one particular generation? What are needs, right? I sometimes have the need to watch television, drink wine. Is that a real need? Or is that just, can I do without? I would strongly argue that I can't. That's a bit of a lie, right? Because you can survive without drinking wine. And what is a compromising need? What does it mean that my need to drink wine is compromised. Does that mean that I can have only one bottle a week? It's a very vague definition. It sort of intuitively appeals to you. And I say, well, yeah, this is right. But then when you start looking at it closely, it doesn't tell you what to do. Which, of course, is the strength of this definition. Everybody is in favor of sustainability. But of course, this is not what academics do. Academics don't like things that are intuitively appealing but not very precise, and people have put together more precise definitions, ignoring Billy Bragg's words that the temptation to take the precious things we have apart to see how they work must be resisted, for they never fit together again. So people have made the definition of sustainability more precise, and they come into 4 different groups. And the first of those is weak sustainability. And Jack Pezzi nowadays, has argued that really sustainability means that utility should not fall. Hartwig said, oh, I don't know how to measure utility, so I'm going to say sustainability means that consumption shouldn't fall. Which leads to the Hartwig rule that sustainable growth is growth where you live off the rents of your capital, but you do not reduce your capital stock. Right? You can only take as much as nature gives you, but not more. You do not run down stocks. Now, if we live on a finite planet, as we do, and then over the very long run, if you follow the Hartwig rule, then Solow, who you see here, argued that that implies that consumption should be constant. That we cannot grow, because inevitably, by the rules of thermodynamics, you're gonna run down your capital stock. The problem with these 3 definitions of sustainability is it's still not very precise, right? If we say that utility should not fall, what do we mean? Do we mean the average utility, or do we mean the utility of everybody on the planet? Do we mean by a non-falling utility that utility should not fall over a century or over 10 years, or should it not fall at all, right? The latter cannot be, right? It cannot be that nobody should ever be allowed to be a little bit less happy than they were a minute ago. Because things happen, you may fall off your bike and break a leg, right? That is a sharp drop in your utility, but it has nothing to do with sustainability, right? So you somehow need to allow for temporary blips downwards. But at what time scale, right? The key point of these definitions of sustainability is that you allow for substitution. Because if we say that utility should not fall or consumption should not fall, it doesn't matter where it comes from. And in these weak definitions of sustainability, you can chop down the forest and give everybody a headset with a virtual reality and an app that allows you to walk into the forest, and you're just as happy, right? Because the experience is just as good. You're actually better off, right? Because in virtual reality you can edit out the mosquitoes and those sort of things and the puddles of mud that makes walking in the forest less pleasant, and you've actually improved things, right? In these definitions of sustainability, you can substitute one capital stock for another. And that is why these are weak definitions of sustainability. John Talbot, no, Talbot Bates is his name. John Talbot is somebody else. Talbot Bates, the guy you see here, took it a step further and said, well, I don't know about consumption and I don't know about utility. Let's just go back to the original definition, which is about needs, right? We should not focus on the consumption side of things, but we should just focus on the production side of things. But of course, that doesn't solve the fundamental problems at all. It just shifts it. And still, substitution is allowed. As long as you can make things, everything is dandy. The alternative to weak sustainability is strong sustainability, lo and behold. And this essentially means that the focus, that the idea that we can destroy nature provided that we replace it with something else that gives us just as much pleasure, that is fine. Strong sustainability steps away from that. And there are, again, various interpretations of this. One is that the yields of resources should not decline. That forests should give their forest products, and rivers should give their river products and services, and they should stay. Either increase or at least not fall. And then you separate them out. Then, because these resources are separate and this rule holds for everything, you have no longer the substitution there. Other than that, it does not really solve fundamental questions, because now we're talking about services that are provided by nature. But we don't say services to whom, services at what time scale, are these services to human beings, are these services to other species as well, right? The good thing about this definition is that you can have some substitution provided that the service remains intact. So one key service is the making of oxygen. And you can cut down the Brazilian rainforest, provided that you expand the Congo rainforest to keep making enough oxygen for us and other animals to go around, right? That's essentially the idea here. The people who say, well, that is not the idea, right? The idea is to keep things intact, and substituting trees in South America for trees in Africa, that is not quite what we had in mind, right? And those people would argue for the stability, or if that's not feasible, the resilience of ecosystems, where ecosystems are much more locally defined. The problem with these sort of arguments is, again, what do you actually mean by stability? Does that exclude all sort of variability that you would see in an ecosystem? Does that exclude, and when you say, well, things should not change, I know I'm now not actually arguing against evolution, because the natural state of nature is change, not stasis, right? So it's not a particularly helpful definition. It is an influential one, and I shouldn't talk too much about Brexit, but the European Union, and the UK still is under those rules, has this as one of its founding principles of environmental protection and nature conservation. That is, if you want to cut down a forest to build a new airport, then according to the current rules, you are obliged to create an equivalent forest elsewhere. Because the rule is that the acreage of trees should stay constant or increase, right? That is the current rule. And it's, I think that's a good rule. Of course, it's not particularly practical, right? Because no forest is the same. And definitely an old forest that, well, actually in Europe there's no natural forests anymore, right? But sort of an old forest that has been there for a couple of 100 years is very different than a newly planted forest, right? Definitely for the first 50 years or so, you would see different trees and different animals and so on and so forth. Is that allowed, right? If we cut down a forest in the south of England and we plant new trees in the north of Scotland, is that a proper substitution? Is that an equivalent thing? These are very difficult questions, right? I have 8 minutes left, and I have 2 points to make. I should be able to do so. There's a third group of definitions of sustainability, and that is that sustainability is what we think it should be. And this is essentially a libertarian argument, that really what matters is not so much what is our definition of sustainability, but how we have arrived at that definition. I think this is the wrong way to look at it. Originally, sustainability was environmental sustainability, and now it's sort of taking on a different life. It becomes a political process. And you may sort of argue in favor of this kind of direct democracy and consultative democracy. That's not what sustainability is about, right? It sort of takes away the original meaning. And for a long time, people took this particular social construct and said, well, sustainability really has 3 pillars. And it includes economic efficiency. The economy should be as large as possible, but it also includes distributional justice. Income gap should not be too wide. And people sort of said, well, sustainability includes those issues of equity and efficiency as well. And that for a long time was sort of the official position, this is sustainability. But then a couple of years ago, the United Nations reformulated the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is now the official position. And what you see is that whereas Brundtland argued about the environment, and later on that became economic efficiency, distributional justice, and environmental quality, now there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And each of these goals has, this is Ed Sheeran, the reason that Ed Sheeran sang at the introduction of the Sustainable Development Goals, at the launch of these goals, is because he's the only guy on the planet who can sing fast enough to get all this text into a 3-minute song, right? And here we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and then there's sub-goals for all of them. And I've color-coded them, right? End poverty in all its forms everywhere. Completely agree, it has nothing to do with the environment, right? End hunger, achieve food security, ensure promote well-being for all at all ages, right? Ensure access to affordable, reliable, modern energy. This has nothing to do with an environmental agenda. This is all a social agenda, right? Perfectly reasonable, perfectly acceptable. Is it sustainability? In blue, I color-coded economic efficiency, promote sustained economic growth. build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive industrialization, and foster innovation. And then only when you get further down the list, you see things that are clearly about the environment, right? Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Not actually about stabilizing climate or anything. No, it's about taking action on climate, like go sit on the M25 and block the traffic, right? That is what matters, not that it actually reduces emission. It does not, right? It actually, because the cars are just waiting for you there, right? And they're still burning, so they're actually burning more CO2 if you block the road and create the traffic jam. But what matters is that you take action, right? Conserve and sustainably use the oceans, protect and restore terrestrial ecosystems, and so on and so forth. So of those 17 goals, sustainable development goals, only 3 nowadays are about the environment. And as I said, these things are useful in and of their own right, and they're worthwhile in and of their own right. Promote peaceful societies. I'm all for that. But where is the environment? And the reason that I raise this, and that's my final point for today, goes back to the Tinbergen rule. And this is Jan Tinbergen, you see here. And Tinbergen, in his 1952 book, showed that if you have n problems, you need n instruments. And this follows immediately from Lagrange's work. That's the second guy you see here. And the intuition is very simple. If you have a car, then you want one steering wheel in the car. Because if you have a car with 2 steering wheels and 2 people driving, you are in trouble, right? Particularly if you want to go around the corner. Similarly, if you have 2 cars and 1 steering wheel for both cars, it actually becomes pretty hairy to take a corner, right? And that is essentially the insight that Tinbergen had, that if you want to achieve 2 things, or if you want to achieve n things, then you should have n control knobs. Not fewer, actually preferably also not more. And if you sort of say, well, I'm all in favor of sustainable development, and then start adding more and more and more things to sustainable development and its definition, then you actually may be tempted to say, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to solve all these problems with this one policy intervention. And this sort of hides the real trade-offs that are there. If you take environmental policy, a lot of environmental problems originate in the way we eat and what we eat, and transport and packets our food. A lot of environmental problems originate from that, and a lot of environmental problems originate from the type of energy that we use and the amount of energy that we use. And therefore, environmental policy is about making food and energy more expensive. There's just no 2 ways around it, right? Either you can impose taxes or you can forbid certain technologies, but you're gonna make energy and food more expensive. Now, energy and food are also necessary goods. So as soon as you make energy and food more expensive, you're gonna hurt the poor disproportionately. Again, there's no 2 ways around it. So what is good for the environment, and therefore good for sustainable development, is bad for distributional issues, and therefore bad for sustainable development. And by sweeping everything under one header, we're going to be sustainable, you just completely lose the real trade-offs and the real choices that are there. And therefore I think it is a mistake to do this. Of course nobody listens to me, and they've done it anyway. Let's see, perfectly on time. that's it for today. I'm going to see you guys on Thursday or on Friday, depending on which group you are. We have a problem set that essentially deepens and extends the material that we have today. Okay, see you guys then.